and welcome to the Reimagining the Latinx Experience book talk series. We're so pleased to have with us today Professor Lisa Magaña and Professor César Silva, who will be talking about their book, Empowered, Empoderados, Latinos Transforming Arizona Politics. And before we get started, I first just wanted to thank a few people who make this book talk series possible. Of course, there is Dean Austin Parrish here at the University of California, Irvine School of Law, who supports the series, as well as Interim Dean Bryant Garth at the American Bar Foundation, who has also been a supporter of our series. There are also the people who actually do the work that makes this possible. In addition to me, Rachel Moran, who's a professor here at UC Irvine, I also work very closely with Robbie Kadri, who oversees events for the UC Irvine Law Centers, and Elizabeth Schatz-Cordero, who is my research assistant and a third-year law student here at UC Irvine. And so now with that, I wanted to just introduce our guest speakers. First, Lisa Magaña. She is a professor in the School of Transborder Studies at Arizona State University. She wears many hats there at the university. She's also the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the entire College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, so a very big responsibility. And she is also the Provost Fellow for Hispanic Serving Institution Initiatives. And this is an incredibly important role as well, because we're just beginning to see a large number of Research One universities become Hispanic serving. And so figuring out how to do that well and become Hispanic thriving is going to be critically important work. She works in the area of immigration and Latino public policy issues. She's the author of a number of books on politics and the border, including this one, which builds on earlier work such as Arizona Immigration and Latinos in Politics in Arizona. So that work is, I think, really valuable. She's so prolific. She also wrote another book the same year this one came out on immigration and Latinos and politics. So we're very fortunate to have her with us. We're also very happy to welcome Professor César S. Silva, who teaches in the Department of Ethnic Studies at Northern Arizona University. He actually received his doctorate in transborder studies with interdisciplinary training in anthropology and political science at Arizona State University. And he also works on U.S. politics with a focus on Chicanx, Latinx public opinion and voter turnout, racial and ethnic identity in the United States, elections and campaigns, and Chicanx, Latinx public policy issues. And so clearly we have two very talented people working in the vitally important area of Latinx politics. And as someone who grew up in Arizona, I found the book especially interesting because it's all about the state that I lived in and that has changed so much in the time that I've been away. So please join me now in welcoming Professor Magaña and Professor Silva.
Thank you. Thank you. What a pleasure to be here. I'm truly humbled to be asked to do this presentation. What we decided to do is I thought I'd put Latino politics into context and define what we mean when we say Latino politics and to think about where we are today when it comes to Latino politics. So Elizabeth's going to help me with the slides. So when I say next, that's because I need to go to the next slide. So Elizabeth, please, next. Okay, so I should say that I'm a political scientist by training. And when I first started studying political science, it was just voting, nothing about Latinos, no other ways about thinking about politics except for just voting, partisanship, how many people voted in this section, which party do people align with. And throughout the years, I have found that Latino politics, yes, is voting, yes, is representation, yes, partisanship, but it's also much, much more. Grassroots, boycotts, immigrant activists. In Arizona, it's been a really interesting case study in democracy, and it's actually really quite beautiful how much impact that Latinos have had on politics in Arizona. And I'm going to come back to this later, but why I think our research is innovative, that's a word that we like to say at ASU, is that we think about, well, what's happening? How can we look at this issue? What are some of the interdisciplinary ways of thinking about Latino politics? And one of the good things about this research is that I think it can play out in many other changing demographic communities, which is what is happening across the country. And so you're going to see, we're going to talk about Latino politics, but keep in mind, the focus of the research is in Maricopa County. And I'm going to say this a couple times. There's 7+ million people in Arizona. More than half of everybody that lives in Arizona lives in Maricopa County. And so this is a really dynamic space. And you'll see that because of migration from other states, the growing Latino population, which is 1/3 of the state and 1/3 of Maricopa County, you're going to see the impact, particularly in this county, with the growth of Latino politics. Okay, so next. Okay, so I think it's helpful to explain sort of the evolution of Latino politics. And I have about, I think 6 or 7, Dr. Silva, that we discuss different phases of Latino politics. And so the first phase is after the annexation of the Southwest, and you had newly, I don't want to say naturalized, but Mexicans that were given US citizenship as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe. And so some of the first politics were characterized as protests and opposition because land that was promised to these Mexican, now American nationals were disputed. They were cheated out of land. Some of the grants were written in English rather than Spanish. And as we know, there was much settling by white settlers in the Southwest in parts that were promised to these, again, new American citizens to play that. So the first phase is characterized by protests and opposition, and that's after the annexation of the Southwest. Next. Okay, the second phase, I like to think of this as a very transnational phase, and this is when we have the first, probably the only discernible immigration of Mexican nationals into the United States. This is after the Mexican Revolution. We know that the first settlers were predominantly in Los Angeles. And what I find interesting is this second phase of Latino politics is very transnational in that you had people that were displaced out of Mexico still very much interested in the politics in Mexico while in the United States. So very transnational or transborder, like we like to use. And so that is a second sort of pivotal phase of Latino politics. Next. Okay, I cannot stress the importance of World War II and its impact on Latino politics. A couple things happened, and for other folks of color that for the first time ever had left the suburbs and saw places that were much better than where they were growing up. They received what was called GI Bill, which many first-time Latinos went to college, were able to buy homes outside of in better suburbs. Some Latinos became US citizens as a result of participation in the armed services. They got naturalization, which was a big issue for Latino Americans. And it also created this sort of new first generation of Latinos that are participating in elected positions. So you start to see the beginning of this. Certainly it's partly going to college and then certainly taking a much more active role. It's not incredibly large, but you start to see it begin. And the study of Latino politics begins after World War II. There are more scholars that are Latino that begin to study this, okay? Next. Okay, the fourth phase, we know this one, the 60s and 70s. Some would say the Chicano movement went to as late as 1978, but it certainly starts in the 60s. And I want to reiterate that it's not just the United Farm Workers, it's community leaders, it's the move for racial inequality at the workplace, It's the effort to improve schools, improve judicial and political systems, social movements and activists to began to work in more traditional and electoral politics structures. And so you start to see much more engagement during the 60s and the 70s under the guise of social reform. Next. Okay, this is now, we saw in the 90s, it was kind of interesting, and you see this in grassroots mobilizing, and we have a great case here in Arizona that I'll talk about, that sometimes activists, after a while, would turn into much more traditional political players. So for example, some of the activists during the Chicano movement then turn to voter registration, or then turn to work in lobby groups such as the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, looking at more traditional ways of challenging political participation. And so, lawsuits or more voter registration. And there's one person here in Arizona that we'll talk about, but started off as a community activist in an organization called Puente. And now he is a councilman in the city of Phoenix. And he talks about, I need to be in both places. We need activism, and we also need to be part of the players in terms of traditional politics. So we see much more, I don't say much more, but there's another phase where we see much more voter registration and partisanship participation. Okay, next. Okay, this is what I like to say is when we actually become not just Mexican politics, but Latino politics. And some of the movements that we saw is that, so we had more people participating, growing numbers of Latinos, growing numbers of Latinos getting older. You've heard this fact of like 1 million Latinos turn 18 every year. So it's a younger group, but it's growing in terms of its size. And so in the mid 2000s, there were some very tough laws that were passed, that were going to be passed nationally in Congress around unauthorized immigrants. And the law basically said that if you are found to be in the United States unlawfully, you could get what is essentially a felony on your record. And for those of you that don't know this, if you get a felony, you are not able to get naturalized status or become a US citizen. And this particular, it was just too much. And what we saw was a groundswelling of organizing of activists that came out opposing this very, very tough immigration initiative. And it was really, really fascinating because I don't know if you remember this, but there was opposition across the United States, not necessarily in big Latino cities, but all over big cities. And you saw, I remember we had congressmen coming out, Latino congressmen, and saying, listen, I'm a Puerto Rican, but this feels like it's anti-Latino. This law is not going to hurt me because I'm a US citizen, but this law comes off as hurting all Latinos. So we saw a coalition, of course, I'll add a lot of different advocates, but where we saw Latinos turning into much more pan-Latino. So you had Cubans, and you had obviously Mexicans, and you had other groups that aligned. It became very international as well. So you had Latino celebrities from Latin America, singers coming out in opposition to these laws. So I kind of see this mid 2000s as this time where it becomes much more broad, and the term Latino politics, I think, is much more applicable in this particular phase. Okay, next. All right, so what we saw happening is that there continues to be a lot of really tough Draconian laws, particularly in Arizona. And Arizona led the way. We were #1 in tough on immigration. And even though we were not, it's like 6th, 7th, and other in terms of large immigrant populations. It's California, it's Texas, but politicians did a really great job, some of them, saying that it was so terrible in Arizona that we need to pass more and more of these laws, which inevitably hurt Arizona because businesses wouldn't want to come here. Why would you if immigration's so bad? And then, of course, there were boycotts by organizations that didn't want to even align with Arizona. So it was pretty stupid, short-sighted politics in terms of some politicians. And so what we saw in Arizona was that, first of all, individuals, kids that grew up during the sort of anti-immigrant time were now getting older and now registering to vote, now participating to vote. They may have been in high school and walked out, but they were politicized to now they're old enough to vote. We also saw, really important, after SB 1070, for those of you that don't know, that was 2010. And in 2010, there was this law called SB 1070 that basically said you can stop someone and you can ask them for documentation and to see whether or not they are a US citizen or in the country lawfully. And it's very, obviously woefully a violation of numerous rights. And it's illegal because you don't have to carry a document, all of us, wherever you go. And went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court said, well, we can keep that one part. If a police officer stops you for a good reason, you can, in fact, ask somebody what their status is. And so now in Arizona, we still have it. It's still a law, but I can say it's pretty much not carried out because it opens as you can imagine, the door to numerous lawsuits. But again, it was passed. It was signed by the governor. And there were just a lot of opposition to the law. And I would say one of the most effective were the boycotts to Arizona that hurt the state financially, that I think was really important in terms of Latino politics. So after SB 1070, there was an organization, an umbrella organization that was created called One Arizona. And what it did was essentially, it was an umbrella, for lack of a better word, that helped fund numerous smaller grassroots organizations. And so, like I mentioned, Puente, and there's some Get Out the Vote ones, there's some for the environment, numerous, and highly La Lucha, highly effective grassroots organizing. And part of what they did is, and Dr. Silva is going to talk about, is think about this new phase, which is the rising American electorate. And it has a couple new different names that we can talk about. But essentially what I think is now the norm is not necessarily, although there were some campaigns, not necessarily just focusing on Latinos, but focusing on first-time voters and getting people out there to participate for the very, very first time. And I'm going to tell a quick story. And if anybody's out there that's heard it, I apologize because I know I've told it many times. So during the election time, I was getting my glasses, I get an eye exam, and there was this beautiful family. It was a male and two young women. And I said, hey, can you imagine you're sitting there, you want to get your eye exam? And I said, hey, are you guys registered to vote? Turns out the daughters were 16, 17, so they were not old enough. The dad was in his mid 30s. And he said, no. And so I got him registered to vote. And I went in, I got my eyes checked, and I came out, my eyes got worse. I came out and he said, guess what? And I said, what? He said, I just got my friend to register to vote. And I was so happy. And I said, let me ask you, why have you never registered to vote? And he said, no one's ever asked me to. And so I think that this is really indicative of this new American electorate, and that targeting first-time, newly naturalized women, people had not thought about. And I think it's been very successful. We've seen some of this sort of success in Georgia as well. But that is what we are sort of experiencing now in Arizona. Next. Okay. These are a couple of years older, but I want to just say, actually, can we go to the next slide too, Elizabeth? I think I have it here too. All right. So we're still getting numbers back from the 22 election. Of course, they're always a little bit lower in the midterm. We know that. We do know that Latino voter turnout has continued to go up. It's crazy. But one of the things, let's see the next slide, please, Elizabeth. Okay, how about the next one? Because some of this you can look all this up yourself. Next one. Okay, so let me tell you what is going on in Arizona. And again, keep in mind Maricopa County, okay? So Latino voter participation has gone up. voter turnout with Latinos has gone up. It's hard to measure the midterm election because it's typically lower for everybody in a midterm election. But what I want to also add here in Arizona is that in Maricopa County, what has been really fascinating is the shift in partisan identity. So it used to be predominantly Republican and then much less the Democratic. And what we've seen shifting was that during Trump, he was just too much for some Republicans. And so we have now a third of Republicans that still identify as Republican. We have a third in Arizona and in Maricopa County, very important, that identify as Democratic. And then we have a third now that are independents. And the independents are these moderate Republicans that just cannot go for Trump. And so for the first time I ever saw Republicans for Biden, that would be yard signs in yards around here. And I think we saw the same thing in this last governor election. I wasn't surprised that we didn't vote in Carrie Lake, very Trumpy-like candidate, because again, we saw that it's a third of these people now are moderate Republicans, and I no longer voting just down party lines. One more. Oh, there we go. So one projection showed that there were over 400,000 Latino voters that voted in 2022 with nearly 37,000 new Latino voters. So these numbers are incredible. And it doesn't speak to the Latino immigrant activists that we have here that are incredible, that will go door to door and say, listen, I can't vote, but can you support a candidate that believes in comprehensive immigration or believes in the rights of immigrants? And that has actually been super, super successful here in Arizona. There was an ousting of a Senate leader, there was a recall, and it's been much to the, much because of these immigrant activists that, and many of which are women. That's a whole other area to study. Okay, is that my part? Let's see, next. Continues to grow, next. Okay, shocking. Most Latinos in Arizona are of Mexican origin. Interestingly, it's we have an issue with age. So there's a aging white population with a growing younger Latino population. Arizona is pretty interesting. So 4 million or more reside in Maricopa County. Again, 85% identify as Democratic, 35% increase. Okay, next. And yes, the aging population said that. Next. All right. Okay. So half the people, again, more than half live in Maricopa County. So what happens in Maricopa County definitely affects the outcome of an election. Incredibly, over 45% of all children K through 12 now identify as Latino in Arizona. And actually we have, which just is fascinating, 75% or more are US born. Doesn't mean they're not US citizens, but this narrative that Arizona is all full of these, unauthorized immigrants. In fact, the Congresswoman Debbie Lasko a while back said when the vaccines came out, she said, I don't think we should give the Latinos in Arizona the vaccine. We should give it to Americans first. So just that presumption that all Latinos in Arizona are undocumented immigrants. And as I mentioned, it's a three-way shift now, Republican, Democrats, and Democratic and independents. And of course, we can talk about the voter fraud, which doesn't exist. All right, I think that's it. And now it's Dr. Silva's turn. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Nell, for that great summary of such important parts of the history that played a role in our research. Hi, how is everyone? I'm Dr. Silva, like Dr. Miranda said. Thank you for being here today. I'm going to talk about the rising American electorate. We did name it a few different names. We also called it the New American Majority. We're mostly going to stick with the rising American electorate. Few things about it. Well, I mean, before I start, right, probably some of you are asking out there like, okay, so you've been talking about Latino history, right? Pre-statehood, Arizona, right? Then you talked about the formation of, Chicano movement, right? And then you tied it all back to modern times, the history, right? That's what you did in the book. It's like, so then why are you presenting on this rising American electorate that's just spreading out, right? That's just including so many different groups. Well, it's important because, you know, like Dr. Magaña said, that in that key phase, right, in the 2000s, this pan-Latino, or, you know, or I know some people call it Latinx, right, and Latino group evolved into trying to incorporate more than just your standard, you know, your majority group, which is the Mexican-American, right, which to this day, even though it is pan-Latino, I believe last I checked, it's still somewhere in the high 80s in terms of Mexican origin, but it is, in fact, more variety in the Latinx community than it used to be. So why is this important? Because that was occurring, right? And then we get SB 1070. And throughout that whole time, you have to understand that there's a proliferation of grassroots organizations that are predominantly Latinx serving, right? They're serving the community in the sense of their focus on like immigration rights, their focus on economic equity, they're focused on LGBTQ rights, right? And like Dr. Magaña said, right, she mentioned that Arizona 1 came in and did this alignment thing, right? But if you notice, I keep saying they're Latino, 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 right? Well, in this last, let's say, I don't know, 13 or so years, give or take, right? It's changed because this pan-Latino existence is existing, right? These groups that I just mentioned to you are predominantly Latinx or Latino serving are now changing into, yes, we still focus on that community because yes, it is still the biggest group in Arizona, right? But we need to evolve, right? Different times, different tactics. And so that's what they're doing here. And that's what we found in our research, speaking to the people who are in these organizations and who were in those organizations. Some of them are city council, right? Some of them are, you know, state senators and so forth now, but still speaking to them at that point, they were telling us that it's a, I guess maybe you can say it's a more inclusive way of getting out the vote, of getting people more civically engaged, right? Because the community they initially started serving still gets served within this group, right? So what is this rising American electorate? It sounds like, I mean, we call it oftentimes the RAE, right? Because we just get used to it, but it sounds like such a like, it's open rights. Like, what could it be? Well, I'll tell you what it is. It's young people, right, of all races. That's a big group, right? It's communities of color. Also, pretty, you know, big statement there, right? Includes a lot of people. And unmarried women of all races. Also includes a lot of people, right? So much so that back when, you know, in 2004 or so, it all, you know, initially, right, in its initial phases of being, you know, discussed and research and so forth, it was already almost half of eligible voters in 2004. 45% is what we found, right? But then we pushed it up to 2018, and now we're talking about 2 out of every 3, a little under that, right? 62%. That's a lot of eligible voters. That's a lot of people that you can go out and speak to, right? Who, like I said, Dr. Magaña mentioned, they're not being spoken to, right? Why didn't you vote? No one ever asked me, right? I asked these questions in my class, like, are you voting? Why not? I don't know. No one ever asked me. I don't know how to do it. I don't have the information, right? Like these little simple speed bumps, seemingly simple, are pretty big walls for a lot of people, right? And so this group is now the focus of what a lot of these groups that I was talking to about earlier that are Latino serving in the Maricopa County area. I'll say Arizona generally, because we did also talk to a few people from Tucson and the surrounding area, but like Dr. Magaña said, we mostly start to Maricopa County. And so what are they saying? Well, let's reach these groups because they're also not being, you know, then no one's talking to them. No one's saying, come vote. No one's answering their questions, right? And so people were asking this, as the research went on, we found out that there were a lot of times like new first-time voters, right? They're young, right? Other thing, they also have reasons for being very low voters. I'm sorry, let me say it again. This group still is they have very low voter turnout rates, right? And so what is the reason for that? When they research this group, you find out that it's simple things that align with other reasons why, you know, generally speaking, people don't vote, such as their lower socioeconomic status. And attached to that is their lower education rate, right? We know that people who vote tend to be a little bit on, you know, upper, you know, higher SES, also educated, right? So contrast to that is why this group, majority of them belong to that group. What else do they not have? They also don't have access to info about voting. Like Dr. Magaña said, right? The little speed bump, for a lot of these people, it's a wall, right? Like the person she spoke to. And I've also spoken to people and they tell me it's simple things like, I don't know how to step one, like what's step one to voting, right? It seems like such an intimidating process. And that, well, I'll actually mention that a little bit right now. What's the other thing? Generally speaking, they have very low access to resources, whether it be voting or just, you know, life resources, let's say, right? We dug into it a little bit, but not too much, so we weren't able to get too much nuance in the sense of resources. My idea and what I got out of it was that it was a combination of resources related to voting and resources relating to life, right? Maybe no car, maybe no ID, right? Maybe can't take the day off to go vote in the middle of the week because I have lower resources because, again, I mostly belong to a lower SES group. So, you know, that's the idea that I got out of that. And one other thing that we found out about this group, they move a lot. In my time, when I was down, you know, I went to grad school, School of Transport Studies, Arizona State. In my time there, I almost met nobody who originated from Phoenix. And so I understand, and most of them did belong to this group, right? That was my experience, right? Of course, it's a small experience, but that was just my experience. And so we said, so then how would you summarize these like hurdles, right? Because you are voting as a group, so you know you have this potential, 62% of eligible voters, but only half of this group votes, right? Less than half, 46%. So what are these things? Well, you had to summarize it, right? What are the things that you would say are your main hurdles? And it was simple: underregistered, underinformed, and under attack. Under attack being the next thing I'm going to discuss, which is under attack for the RAE and also under attack for the Latino community in general in Arizona. Okay, I think most of us have watched the news and we've seen the guys with the masks, right, dressed in khaki pants, sitting in the back of their truck, right, intimidating the voters, and you know, in Phoenix, right downtown. I'm guessing that most people on here probably have, because I think that made the national news if I remember right. Because I remember seeing it in Texas, of all places, right? I'm like, oh wow, that's intense, right? They're sitting there with their guns, right, legally carrying, and just kind of giving you a look. That's a tactic. That wasn't just an off chance two guys sitting in the back of the truck. No, that's a tactic by people to persuade groups such as RE and others to not vote. I mean, it can be very intimidating, and it's proven to be effective. What are some other things, just generally speaking, right, that we found impacted this group, and again, the Latino group in general? More stringent voter ID laws. They shift the precinct boundaries, right? Also really confusing to a lot of people, the rules about voter registration. Change them all the time. Makes it very difficult, right, for the community. We already talked about this legalized voter intimidation, right? It's within the laws, everything they did, but, right, it impacts. Cutbacks, right? Cutbacks in the early voting sites, cutback in vote by mail. Also, legislation meant to do that and meant to, you know, purge voter rolls such as the people, right? Permanent early voting. And so, what's another thing? We found that there's a lack of voting sites. I think I haven't looked at it in the last, you know, year or so, but a couple of years ago, I looked at it, and I think that that's improving. The lack of voting sites was a little bit more mid, you know, definitely early 2000s, mid, you know, early teens, 2020 to 15 or so. But I think since about the 16 or so, it's improving slightly. What else did we find? Just in that time, also inequitable distribution of voting machines, right? And then also just inequitable resources, right? Certain places had certain things, long lines where, you know, we would find them in certain places, certain neighborhoods, predominantly, you know, Democratic areas, predominantly communities of color, right, predominantly Latinx communities, and so forth. And then that's the general idea. And then certain laws are also being proposed, right? And they're trying to get these voter restriction, voter suppression laws passed. We've seen like so I think that let me see if I remember right, it was a Proposition 309 that was asking people to write their birthdays and then also a voter ID number in the back of their mail-in ballot. It was rejected, right? Then you had this idea of if you don't vote in the people for 2 consecutive ones, that's SB 1046, they'll take you off the roll, right? And then another one was you have to produce your ID when you're voting in person. So just like the general idea of all of these is just to deter these communities, including, you know, RAE, and then specifically for our research, the Latino community, from participating, right? It became, again, I keep saying the same thing, but from a little speed bump, but it becomes a wall to a lot of people. There's a lot of shifting parts.
If I may add really quick,
of course.
another issue is your signature. So for Latinos and other, say, immigrants, they might have hyphenated names, or they might be slightly different when they change, or if English is not your first language. the signature can be changed and their ballots are thrown out. And so we have seen this is particularly bad in immigrant communities, that again, that the names not matching.
Absolutely.
That was great. So
No, I think that, is there another slide, Elizabeth?
yeah, let's see what, we turned it up, doing that. Yeah, and here in Arizona, we have had this whole voter fraud. It just keeps coming out more and more. It just wasn't an issue. And I think just the whole narrative that the voting's not safe, and Carrie Lake still hasn't said she's lost. I mean, it's crazy. And then it turned out the previous attorney general had hid the fact that there was no voter fraud, so he may be hard. Anyway, so there's a lot of misinformation, and just saying, there's a real push right now. We're a state that votes by mail. It's a big. I was like, what is it? Like 80%? Some of my political science friends.
That's right.
And there's a move in the legislature to stop voting by mail. And then, as you can imagine, how crazy that was during the pandemic. So, the fact that we had such good voter turnout speaks to how politics, how important it is right now in this state, and again, particularly in this county. So, thank you. Do we have questions? Are you done?
Yeah, I'm done. I'm definitely done.
And also, I just wanted to mention that if you have questions, you should feel free to put them into the Q&A function, and Elizabeth will then pose the questions to our panelists, and we really welcome your questions, so please do that. In the meantime, I just wanted to follow up because you didn't really say too much about Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who became a very polarizing figure. And at least, as I read the book, he was also one reason that people mobilized, because his tactics were seen as so outrageous. And various techniques were used, including litigation, to try to oust him from office. And so I wondered if you could just say a few words about Sheriff Joe, as he was called, and his place in this kind of dynamic that you've described. And then when we start getting questions from the audience, we can pose those.
Okay, I can take this. So one time I was on the radio of the local NPR station, KJazz, and I was right after him. He had made the comment. Anyway, he's always making these really crazy comments. But anyways, it made national news, and anyways, doesn't matter. Yes, let me tell you a little bit about Joe Arpaio. So it all started off with this thing called 287G. And I want to get too technical, but there was a little provision in the 1996 Act that said, if you are specially trained and you're a police officer, only when you arrest a really bad person, a murderer, rapist, really bad person, only then can you ask whether or not they are in the country, if they're a US citizen. And so Maricopa County, which is the police for the county, because some cities have their own police, some cities don't, so they will contract Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. And so Maricopa County, the sheriff's position is an elected position. And he became much more popular as he became tougher on immigration, almost like clownish in terms of what some of the tactics that he did. And so Maricopa County Sheriff's Office had the most people that used this 287G policy, and then it went out of hand. It then turned into not stopping bad guys, but stopping somebody who's their light is off in their car, or they didn't put their signal on, or detaining women in the front yard at yard sales. So just went way over, violated numerous laws again, but he became more popular, of course, with some, not others. And he was eventually found to be breaking the law, and he had never been trained under 287G, which was a big deal. Everyone assumed he had. And so the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office was sanctioned, Justice Department came in, definitely racial profiling, devastated the community. Mom or dad would go to work and they'd get picked up, and kids didn't have anyone to take care of. It was awful. It was awful. And when it stopped, this is when SB 1070 was created. So it was sort of a message like, okay, you can't do this in Maricopa County, but the legislature said we're going to pass it statewide. We didn't get to vote on SB 1070. The legislature passed it. The governor at the time, Jan Brewer, I had to catch myself, I almost said Bruja, was going to, she signed it. And because she signed it, this helped her popularity. And there's no doubt that that stance is what got her reelected. And so it was even, we did some interviews with, so Maricopa County chose to use this 287G money, the special training money. In the Department of Tucson, which is by the border, the Department of Tucson didn't want to use 287G money. And we have interviews where they said, we felt like we were punished because the state legislature wanted us to get this federal money. And so SB 1070 became a state law, but again, we didn't vote on it. The legislature passed it. And I think it was such a public relations fiasco. It made Arizona look racist. It brought international attention. Again, the boycotts really, really hurt the state. And just really quick, there was another policy that the governor was going to sign that was, I don't have to have business if I feel offended by my religion or whatever. And the Chamber of Commerce stepped in and said, don't do it, Governor, because you remember the economic fiasco that we had with SB 270. So yes, definitely was, but it all played into creating these new activists and these new political players and these grassroots organizations, definitely.
Yeah, I was going to say that was the thing, right? They were reelected into office during that time period, but that's no longer the case in Arizona. Now it's more like, well, go down this path if you choose to, but these groups have proven over and over again that they'll vote you out. So the things have changed in the last 20 years, definitely.
Did you think that it was easier to get people mobilized in response to a person rather than a series of policies? I mean, he became the face in a way of these anti-immigrant movements. He was ultimately pardoned also by President Trump.
That's right. Yes. That's such a good question. I feel like it was all sort of, I don't know. What do you think? Let Dr. Silva answer.
That was that's kind of tough because, when you interview these people who went through these things, a constant is a kind of a combination of having a face to it, but also SB 1070, that's a real thing that impacted people in a real way, in a scary way for a lot of people, right? And such shocking scenes of these kids, having no one's coming home type of thing, right? Narrative. So I don't know. I mean, my answer is, it's not a real answer, I don't think, because mine's more like, I think it's both, to be honest. You have Arpaio, you have Brewer, you have Pierce, you have these figures, but then again, you do have these policies like SB 1070 that were very, very impactful, or the Sensenbrenner bill in 2006, right? That brought out hundreds of thousands of people. So like these ideas started, just kind of existing in the brain, kind of like, okay, so this can get, this can be bad. So it's a combination of these bills and the people, in my opinion.
We do have a question submitted. Thank you for your wonderful and richly detailed presentation. In the different phases of Latino politics that you identify, did you uncover any themes of unique or central contributions to democracy from the Latino community? What can we point to as evidence or indicators that show Latinos make our politics and polity better? Thanks.
I'll go first, okay? So I have been struck, thank you for that great question, Francisco. I have been always thinking about the Voting Rights Act and the passage of it and the meaning of it. And then it was updated in '82, kind of more so for Latinos, but generally in the '60s, it was for all groups. And it's been harder for Latinos under the Voting Rights Act because, if I ask a student, are you white? And they'll say no. And then I'll say, well, are you Black? No, they're Latino. So there's sort of that identity, or the way that we are defined, that the Voting Rights Act can't always solve solutions. So a good example here is that when we vote, we have to show us, as Dr. Silva said, more forms of identification. Well, people say, well, big deal. What's wrong with that? So for example, Native people here don't have a birth certificate, or another law is that you have to have an address. Some people have a PO box. Poor people, people of color, Latinos, they may not, so we don't think about these particular issues or barriers. It seems simple, right? You're not Black, you're white. You can't be a racist because you're a Latino, right? And that has been a challenge that continues to be an issue that we have to navigate. And so that's why I want to say distinctly is that Latino politics isn't just voting, isn't just partisan, isn't just organizations. And I know you know that, but again, the impact of these immigrant activists, and it all again is this beautiful sort of democracy that I think is being challenged because of who Latinos are, that it's very nuanced. It's not so clear cut when we define and think about Latino politics. And so I think that contribution or that notion of that sort of nuanced identity is in sort of the way we have to conceptualize Latino politics.
I think one of the themes that I uncovered, and it was a combination of the interviews we did, but also just the reviews we went through. And it was, I was learning as I was going. So I was learning and I was seeing these things of, these organizations that existed before the state of Arizona did, right? In the mid to late 1890s or so, 1892, 1894, right? Arizona didn't become a state for another 20 years. And there's already these organizations and this idea of, I always go back to this idea of like familism, right? Familismo, right? In the Latino culture, Mexican American culture. And it already feels that way, right? You have people that are moving here and they're like, how can I help you, right? Like, how can I serve you and improve your life here, right? And so that relates to politics because if you go down the timeline, those, mutualistas, organizations that started back in that day, they're the ancestors of what we know now. So that's how they impacted it. And they still operate in a very similar way, right? It's like, how can I help you? Like, how can I help you? And how can I culturally serve you, right? I know that you don't want me to just show up at your door, right? And be like, hey, come vote. You want to get to know me. You want to talk about it, right? You want to have some, I don't know, I think a pretty common one that people would say would be like, you want to have some pan dulce and cafecito or something, right? And just talk about it and like get to know each other and serve each other and not just use each other, right? Just like a community. And again, that ties back to something that's very specific to this group, right? It's a community and they want to be catered to in that way, right? And again, familismo, right? Tying things to the family. And so that's something that I saw, again, 1890s to 2023, it's such a long time, but there's a lineage there, and there is things that are that they have in common, and that's how it has impacted politics. Because now, I interviewed somebody. He was at I don't know if I can say his name, so I'm just gonna say I interviewed somebody that was a campaign manager for somebody that helps run Phoenix to this day, I think. And so I asked him, I said, what, like, in your opinion, like, what is like Latino Latinx politics? And he goes, you know what I'm sick of? I'm sick of people telling me that we don't participate. He goes, I'm sick of that, man. Like they must not know what we do here. He goes, some of our leaders of our orgs are undocumented. They're DACA kids and they can't even vote, but they're leading it. But number two, he's like, I participate. He goes, I am, I can't mention the campaign, I'm sorry. I work for so-and-so, right? And they're impacting this city in such a big way. And I am out there, right? I'm doing these things and I'm brainstorming and I'm thinking of these things. And he tells me, he's like, and guess what? My mom, who's now retired, she helps me do this. How does she do it? She supports me, she loves me, she feeds me. And I was like, I asked him, of course, naturally, my question was, do you still live with your mom? And he said no, that he's already grown up, but that his mom doesn't. He thought it was pretty funny because he was a little bit older. Anyway, I'm sorry, that's a tangent on my own and a conversation me and him. But no, but then I asked him a real question, follow-up question. I was like, so then you're saying that people in the background that traditionally don't get credit for anything, they should be credited? credited? And he's like, yeah, absolutely. He goes, those are the people that were, that are feeding the people that are out in the streets. Those are the people that are waking them up. Those are the people that are organizing, and those are the people that are, getting the places the grunt work, as he said, right? The organizing, getting these like venues. He goes, then you see people marching in the street. He goes, absolutely. You see people voting, absolutely, right? That's the idea of black and white, political engagement. But the Latinx, the Latino Mexican American community, they live and they exist in a much more gray area of political participation, which is why we wanted to do this, right? We wanted to talk about this legacy of political activism, but we wanted to talk about it since 1890s to now. And so then I think your question was, Francisco, right? As evidence or indicators that make our politics and polity better, they do so by including others that traditionally don't get credit for being politically active. Right, this idea that the Latino community does not participate, it's untrue, right? According to our research, it's untrue. They might not be counted as tally vote, right? But there's more to it than that. So that would be my answer to that.
I would just add that we end the book with an interview with a young person named Randy Pettis. I always mix up Randy Pettis. And we just loved his story so much. We just thought, what a great way to end the book. And he's a young, in his 20s, and he's an activist, very prominent activist.
It's amazing. Yeah.
His mom, I believe, is Latina, and dad is not. Or no, dad is, mom is not, because it's next. And he doesn't speak Spanish, and he says the same. He works with immigrant activists and women, and I think that in the past, there's been this sort of old generation of this is the only way you can be a political activist. And we have found that this is just such a new and inclusive and progressive group that the sort of old school ideas of, the Chicano politics that we paved the way for you. There was a lot of that we heard. But it's
you
now-
must speak Spanish.
You don't speak Spanish, so you're really not a Latino. I mean, these kind of dated, I think, ideas of identity. And Randy ends the book saying, I don't think I could have been here in this movement years ago. I don't think I would have fit in. But that's just to speak about this new American electorate, and that how much more inclusive, and it's not short-sighted. I think that's what I really love about this, is that, again, I'm going to repeat myself. My daughters would say, Mom, you repeat yourself. But it's just, here's some really beautiful democracy is going on when we think about the activism, the electoral politics, outreach. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I was also curious, while we wait for any additional questions from the audience, about the really striking difference between California and Arizona, where in the wake of 187, which was the anti-immigrant proposition, people mobilized, and today we're essentially, I think, a one-party state by and large, and it's so heavily dominated by Democrats. But in Arizona, there's been activism, but there's been sort of a splintering into 1/3 Democrat, 1/3 Republican, 1/3 independent. And I wondered if that configuration is stable over time, because it's sort of like a three-party system. And whether or not you think there will be shifts in the future. I mean, Kirsten Sinema just surprised, I think, a lot of people who aren't familiar with Arizona politics by declaring she's an independent instead of a Democrat, and that there are more independents in Arizona than there are Democrats. So how do you see that three-party split working out over time?
I don't see, well, okay, so I did interview Adrian Fontes, who's now the Secretary of State of Arizona for the book, but now he's Secretary of State, and he's great. He was during the 2020 election, he was criticized for, this voter fraud, when in fact he was absolutely brilliant on every aspect of it. So he talked about that he thinks that it's no longer going to be partisan politics. It's issue or candidate. And if Maricopa is any sign, that's exactly what's going on now, that it's not the candidate. And certainly we see Republicans that had previously Republican always are identifying as independents. And the other thing that's here in Arizona is in the primary election, you have to vote party-wise, but in the general, you can vote whoever you want to vote. So that's something I wonder if that is going to be changing here. But I really do believe that it's not, partisan is not the only sort of big influence anymore. I don't know. But I'd say, really quick, Maricopa County is purple. We're not a blue state by any means, but the county is definitely purple.
I was going to say, you mentioned the difference between California and Arizona. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Moran. I believe that a big role in that was played by those people who were, they decided, they were disenfranchised with 187 and so forth. They decided to move towards the left at that point, when the people who in Arizona who were turned off by the SB 1070 stuck with the party. And so that was such big numbers that made a big difference in the way the states have operated since then. And that's why you have, a more, a different path to these states, even though they seem in a way a little bit similar, right? That, the awakening of the youth and the youth of color really has impacted the politics. But that initial step of those big Proposition 187 and the SB 1070, it depended on, I'm trying to remember the exact group, but they went towards the left and one went towards the right. And now you see the different states, right? One's, like you said, almost a one-party state, and the other one's more purple, right? But I was going to say about the independent and the independent Republican Democrat, it seems to be the way. I know that it definitely empowers this third party, not I'm saying third party, independent, sorry. I'm pretty sure most independents don't want to be called a third party. It seems to empower them quite a bit, and it is a lot more about candidates and what are they about. And so I don't know, personally, it's definitely something to study, right? What I don't know where it's going to go, but I think more and more people are going to go to that route and being an independent.
Elizabeth, we had one comment from the audience, I think, that came in, and maybe we'll end with that. And did you want to read that, and then we'll close?
I can read it. Thank you both for all this history and context regarding the trajectory of Latinx politics in Arizona. I learned so much and so value your work and highly informative presentation.
Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you.
And I think that's exactly the right note to end on, because we are very grateful for the time that you've shared with us, the expertise that you've illuminated us with so well. I mean, it was so clear and so compelling a story, and we're very grateful to you. And I appreciate all the comments and questions from the audience as well. So just to close, I wanted to alert you to our next book talk, which will take place on March 22nd, also at 12 noon Pacific time, with Professor Danielle Olden. And she is going to be talking about her book, Racial Certainties, Mexican Americans, School Desegregation, and the Making of Race in Post-Civil Rights America. It's a really deep dive into a desegregation case in Denver, which was the first to look at a district that had a substantial number of Latinx students and was outside the South. And so I think that, it's the first kind of Supreme Court decision we have on that. And she's really given us a wonderful history. So I hope you will join us for that. And then thank you so much again, Dr. Magaña, Dr. Silva, for these fascinating observations about my own home state of Arizona. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth, for your work. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Elizabeth.